All right, diving into our third game here. Magnus Carlsen is playing as white. He opens 1e4, and here Hans Niemann, he goes for the Sicilian defense with the move 1c5. Now, this is a big surprise for me. When Hans Niemann is playing against Magnus Carlsen or Hikaru or other top grandmasters, he typically responds 1e5, trying to head for a Berlin defense. Instead, the move c5 on the board. This means Hans Niemann is looking for a fight in this game. Now from here, Magnus knight to f3, d6 from Hans, and instead of the open Sicilian with the move d4, Hans would probably go for a knight over Sicilian. Instead, the move bishop b5 on the board by Magnus Carlsen. This is the Moscow variation. The idea is very simple. You want to give that king on the e8 square a check, then go short castles, and then eventually go probably c3 and d4, trying to get that typical pawn structure in the center. Now here, Hans Niemann has a choice, either knight d7 or bishop d7 to block the check. In the game, Hans goes for the more combative option, knight d7. And from here, Magnus starts his idea of trying to get that pawn center on d4 at e4. He goes c3, setting up d4 next. So now Hans, what is he going to do about it? Knight to f6, hitting the pawn on the e2 square. Now Magnus is basically forced to go either queen to e2 or bishop d3. Surprisingly, bishop d3 is a playable move. The idea is to go to d3, then back to c2 at some point, and then finally d4 later, but instead queen e2 on the board. This is a very solid idea. The queen does support the pawn on the e2 square, and from there, white's going to castle, go rook d1, so rook f d1, and d4. And it's a little bit different having the queen on e2 and the rook on d1. Typically, in these 1e4 openings, white keeps the queen on d1 for a little while, then brings the other rook to e1. So I'll be covering the subtleties of this kind of position as we go along. Here, Hans Niemann, a6, hitting the bishop. Magnus retreats. Then b5, bishop c2. And here, Hans Niemann has a big choice. He has to figure out how he wants to develop his king side. Specifically, the problem is that dark squared bishop on the f8 square. Here, black has three main ideas to do that. One is e6, more of a Scheveningen style move. The other is e5 in the spirit of the Najdorf or the Sveshnikov Sicilian. And finally, there's the move g6, intending bishop g7 in the spirit of the dragon. Now, Hans Niemann delays this decision for one more move. In the game, he goes bishop b7, putting pressure on that pawn on the e4 square. Currently, it is defended, and that gives Magnus the time he needs to go d4 very quickly. So here, Magnus castles. And then Hans goes e6, showing his intentions. He wants to go bishop e7, then short castles in the spirit of the Scheveningen. The problem with this move, or not the problem, more the drawback of this setup, is it does allow a very fast d4 from white. Magnus does get it in, d4 on the board. And here, Magnus, he maybe has a very slight advantage. He does have that pawn center in the middle of the board. However, overall, Hans Niemann will be able to strike at some point with the move e5, something like that, and it will transpose to more of a Roy Lopez style position for black where he should be relatively okay. Now here, the best plan for Hans Niemann is going to be bishop d7, followed by short castles. Instead, he delays castling for one more move. He goes queen to c7. Now, the drawback of this move, of course, is that Hans Niemann is not getting his king castled, and here, Magnus does have a way to exploit the idea. He can go a4 immediately. Now, the challenge of this move for Hans Niemann as black is you would want the rooks on the a8 square and the f8 square connected if he had already castled. Here, that isn't possible. And for example, black does encounter some tactical problems if he tries to castle the best move. And here, Magnus can go e5 immediately, creating problems in the middle of the board. I don't want to go into it too much, but this is the line to take advantage of Hans Niemann's inaccurate move, queen to c7 in this position. Again, instead, bishop e7, followed by castles immediately was the idea. Now here, Magnus, instead of going d4, spinning on the queen side, he goes bishop d3. Now this is a very curious looking move. The idea, one, is he's putting pressure on the b5 pawn. For example, if he goes a4 later, then both his bishop and his queen are piling up on that pawn. And beyond that, Magnus is sort of egging Hans on to go for the break c4, expanding on the queen side. So, for example, if Hans went c4, it would force the bishop back to the c2 square. However, it does release the tension in the center, and now those pawns on d4 and e4 are even more powerful than they were before. So bishop d3 by Magnus is sort of a weird, undeveloping move, sort of begging Hans to go c4. Now, Hans Niemann is no dummy. He doesn't fall for the idea, at least not yet. He goes bishop e7, intending short castles, And now the whole a4 idea from white isn't that big of a deal, as black is castling on the next move. Now here, Magnus, he goes knight d2, the best square for the knight. From here, his plan may include rook to e1 or rook d1, and then knight f1 to g3 in the spirit of the Roy Lopez or the Italian openings. Now here, Magnus, once again, delays castling. Castling was likely the best move here. Instead, rook to c8, the idea being trying to increase the pressure on the c file. For example, now, if he goes c takes d4 at some point, the queen and the rook do a nice job piling up on the future open c file. However, it's not a big threat yet, as white's pawns and bishops control all the squares on the c file. So here, Magnus just expands on the queen side with the move a4. Now, Hans Niemann's next move is very interesting, but before I show you that, go ahead and do me a huge favor, Chess YouTube. Go ahead and smash that like button. It's the best thing you can help me do to get more views on this video. Please, by all means, smash that like button. And now, back to the content here. Here, black goes c4. This is a very committal idea by Hans Niemann. The idea, of course, is that bishop is being knocked back to the c2 square. Bishop c2 is Magnus Carlsen's response. But again, now that tension in the center on the pawns on d4 and e4 is released, and here Hans Niemann is going to have a much harder time challenging the center. Now, his follow-up idea is to go e5 in the spirit of the Roy Lopez opening. Now, this position almost looks like a closed Roy Lopez, where white went queen to e2 instead of rook to e1. Almost everything else is the same. Literally every other piece could be seen in a Roy Lopez. So now, Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing in this kind of position? Well, again, typically the queen is going to be on d1. If that's the case, his basic plan is h3, rook e1, knight f1, knight g3, and then going from there, perhaps d5 at some point. Now, of course, the queen being on the e2 square does change things, and here white has a wide variety of ideas. d5, immediately trying to block the center is possible. Beyond that, a takes b5, and even b3, trying to create something on the queen side right away is playable. Instead of that, here Magnus Carlsen plays a move that is just so typical for his games. He goes rook d1. Now, the idea behind this move, first of all, obviously, when you have the queen on e2 in these e4 openings, it's a good idea to go rook d1 next. However, beyond that, here Magnus is just maintaining the tension in the center. He's basically saying, the more tension I have in the position, the more likely my opponent, Hans Niemann, is to mess up, as he's simply not on my level in this game. And so, rook d1, the best move to maintain literally all of the options on the board. Now from here, Hans Niemann castles. Magnus goes knight f1. Black goes rook to e8. Again, a very standard idea in these Roy Lopez-style moves. Perhaps black wants to go bishop f8 next. And if Hans Niemann ever takes on the d4 square with his e-pawn, then the rook will be lined up on this newly open e-file with the queen. Now, Magnus sees that, and finally, in this position, he doesn't go on autopilot and go knight g3. Instead, he plays the very strong idea of d5, finally locking in the center. These pawns on d5, e4, d6, and e5 are not being traded anytime soon. And here, Magnus Carlsen actually has a very sizable advantage. Now, what is he going to be doing in this position? Well, Magnus has the option of playing on the queen side, for example, with opening up the a-file, or on the king side, perhaps with knight g3, knight to f5, maybe even like h3, g4 ideas could be playable. Now, Hans Niemann, on the other hand, playing on the king side right away is not going to be an option. He may have an opportunity to do a King's Indian-style move f5 later in the game. Stick around for that. But for right now, his main idea is in the spirit of the Barreyer variation of the Roy Lopez, where he has to go knight to c5, putting pressure on that pawn on the a4 square. So with that in mind, here Hans Niemann immediately knight c5. Again, pressuring a4, but beyond that, also pressuring, it's a weird arrow, also pressuring the pawn on the e4 square. Now here, Magnus, he has the option of releasing the tension on the a-file. A takes b5 is possible, but instead here, he simply goes h3. A decent preparatory move on the king side. This turns out to be the strongest idea, and the reason for this is knight takes a4 and b takes a4 are actually not good moves for black, surprisingly. And here, Hans Niemann, he actually falls for the trap. He takes on b4 with the pawn. Now, this is a very standard idea in the Roy Lopez. It typically works out. However, here, it was not the best idea. It's actually a big blunder. And now Magnus Carlsen has a very sizable advantage if he follows up precisely. Real fast, instead of this, here black should have simply gone g6, a very common move in the Barreyer, perhaps following up bishop f8, bishop g7, maybe h5, something where it's kingside advance, and so on. Instead, B takes a4 on the board for black. B takes a4. And here, Magnus has a very shocking idea. Bishop takes a4, simply giving up the bishop on the a4 square. Now, typically, again, you don't want to give up your light-squared bishop. That piece is just so important for white's attacking chances. For example, that bishop being here lined up on this diagonal. If the e-pawn ever moves, perhaps white goes f4 trying to open the king side. You basically cannot get an attack going without that light-squared bishop on this diagonal. So bishop takes a4, a split-second decision by Magnus Carlsen in this blitz game. And it's the key move. Here's why. After Hans Niemann takes back with the knight, Magnus takes with the rook. Black goes a5, try to lock down the queen side, and the pawn now being defended by the queen. Perfectly fine move. But here's the key difference in this position. That bishop on the b7 square, it is simply biting on granite on d5, and it is never getting back to the c8 square. Or if it is, it's going to take at least 2 tempos, rook to a8, and then bishop c8. And this gives Magnus Carlsen enough time to get something going on the king side with perhaps knight g3 to f5, perhaps bishop g5, and so on. Here Magnus jumps in with the bishop, pressuring the knight on the f6 square. Magnus playing on both sides of the board here. Now this move puts pressure on the knight. It also sets up rook d to a1, where he can now double up the rooks on the a file, and from there it's going to be much harder for black to defend that pawn on the a5 square. Now here Hans finds the best idea, knight d7, getting the knight out of the way of the attack. And here Magnus plays a very curious move, bishop e3. Instead, bishop takes e7 may have been the strongest idea. Again, just trading with tempo. Then you follow up with knight g3, intending knight to f5 with a tempo on that rook on the e7 square. Instead, bishop e3 by Magnus. Magnus, I think, trying to maintain the tension in the position at all costs. He's just saying, the more complicated the position, the more likely I am to win against Hans Niemann. I'm just a better player, and I have more experience, no shame to him. But this move was quite a bit weaker. And here Hans Niemann finds the best idea, f5. We're anything on the king side, that King's Indian style move, King's Indian defense style move. And here, from this position onwards, this game becomes an absolute dogfight. Both players are just trying to swindle and confuse each other as quickly as they can. So this is going to be some absolute peak chess here. Here Magnus takes on the f5 square. Good move, but then Hans Niemann, knight to f6, pressuring the d5 pawn with the knight. Now, of course, there is literally no good way to defend the pawn. The queen can't get there. The knights can't get there. The dark squared bishop obviously can't get there. And that means white's going to lose his key central pawn on d5. So what does Magnus do about it? He starts knight g3, developing the knight. Instead, the immediate rook d to a1 may have been a little bit more precise, as the knight on g3 isn't really doing that much yet. Now here Hans takes on d5 with the knight. Magnus goes rook d to a1, pressuring the a5 pawn. Good move. And now Hans Niemann, he has a few different options. For example, taking on e3 is certainly possible here. Instead, bishop to f8. What is the idea of this move? You don't defend the pawn on a5. You don't take the bishop. Honestly, I'm not too sure what the idea of this move was. Now Magnus takes on a5. And here Hans Niemann, knight to f4. Now this move lays a trap. Hans Niemann is just begging Magnus Carlsen to take on f4 with the knight. Bishop takes f4 would be a massive blunder. Obviously, after e takes f4, you have a double attack on the queen with the rook and on the knight with the pawn. That would be game over. However, as long as Magnus doesn't play bishop takes f4, this turns out to be a massive mistake. Here, Magnus Carlsen finds the best move, queen d1. And now here, the queen is out of the attack of the knight. Bishop takes f4 is a threat, as the queen is no longer on the e-file with the rook. And beyond that, Magnus maintains all of the pluses in his position. Now here, Hans is basically forced to jump into the d3 square. Knight d3 is what he plays. Of course, knight d5 coming back with the knight isn't possible, as white can simply play rook takes d5, winning the two minor pieces and only giving up the rook. For example, rook takes, then bishop takes, then queen takes. So that would not be a good idea. Instead, knight d3 on the board for Hans Niemann, but now Magnus, he has a wide variety of very, very good moves here. For example, rook a7, pinning the bishop is great. Even moves like f6, trying to sacrifice a pawn, believe it or not, work out. Instead, knight g5 on the board for Magnus. The idea, he's eyeing those light squares on the king side. He may also want to follow up with the move queen to h5. This is one of the benefits of keeping this queen on this diagonal. From there, he's threatening perhaps queen f7 or queen takes h7 ideas. Now here, Hans Niemann, he does not stop trying to swindle Magnus. Queen to c6, threatening checkmate in one move on the g2 square. The audacity of this man in this match. Now Magnus defends. Knight 3 to e4, a good move, but now the knights are overloaded. And here Hans Niemann just goes h6. And now what the heck is Magnus supposed to do? Obviously, if he goes knight to f3 or knight to e6, queen takes e4 is the move, winning at knight, again threatening checkmate in one move. You can't move the knight, but if you don't move the knight, what the heck are you supposed to do? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to figure out the winning idea for Magnus Carlsen. It is absolutely brilliant. Now, I'm going to give you a hint. He actually didn't find it in the game, but this move is so unbelievable, and it does occur repeatedly in this game. I do want to mention it right here, right now. So I hope you found it. If you did, you deserve 5 Happy Meals, my friend. The winning idea here, or the best idea here from Magnus, is rook to a6, a truly brilliant move. All right, what's the idea? First of all, if you take with the queen, obviously the rook captures the queen. If you take with the bishop, then queen to h5. This move is insane, and if black takes the knight, you recapture with the other knight, and suddenly queen h7 is threatened. Now, this queen to h5 idea has to occur after bishop takes a6, because now the bishop and the queen are not threatening checkmate on g2. That way, if black takes on g5, knight takes g5 wins for white, as there's no checkmating threat. That is the key idea. Instead, if you don't take the rook on a6, say queen d7, then all the same, queen h5, and if black takes on g5, then knight takes g5, you're threatening checkmate on h7. It's very, very hard for black to defend this. So overall, rook to a6 was an absolutely insane idea by Magnus Carlsen if he found it in that position, and he didn't. Instead, he makes a big mistake, queen to g4. Hans Niemann's swindling ideas are paying off in the game. Now he takes on g5, white takes back on g5, and here, Hans Niemann is up a piece, and if the queen ever moves off g4, queen takes g2, checkmate is still a threat. Hans Niemann has outswindled Magnus Carlsen so far in this game. Unbelievable. Here, Hans, bishop e7, putting pressure on the knight on the g5 square, but knight to e6, Magnus jumping in with the knight, that knight a monster, and now Magnus threatening checkmate on g7 as the bishop no longer controls the g7 square. Of course, Hans has an idea. Bishop f6 defends g7 for now, but then bishop g5 trying to deflect the bishop away. Here, Hans takes on g5, white takes back, and here in this position, Hans Niemann has a critical decision. Once again, checkmate is being threatened in one move. This is a blitz game. You don't want to miss that. So now here, what should Hans Niemann be doing? In the game, he makes a very sensible decision. Rook to e7. Now, obviously here, the rook is not hanging. It defends g7, and if white takes on e7, then queen takes g2, again, is checkmate in one move. Hans Niemann, these swindling ideas never stop. But rook to e7 turns out to be a little bit of a mistake for Hans Niemann. Instead, the key idea for black is unbelievable. You actually need to give up the exchange. Rook takes e6. What's the idea? After f takes e6, you just go rook to e8. You're going to win this pawn back on the e6 square. White's attack is over. His rooks on the queen side are nowhere near close enough to the king to do any damage. Obviously, no g7 checkmating ideas. Black still has the bishop and the queen. That knight on d3 is a monster. And once the rook wins the pawn on the e6 square, it can shuffle over along the 6th rank and cause havoc on white's king side. So giving up the exchange, knowing you're up a piece, stopping the attack, and getting your own attack going with monster pieces, that would have been the best idea for Hans, and that may even have been enough to win the game. Instead, rook to e7 on the board for Hans Niemann, and now Magnus Carlsen. He finds the idea. Rook to a6, the brilliant move. Now, we saw this move before. The idea is a little bit different here. Obviously, there is no queen takes g7 idea or something like that. Here, if black takes the rook, which he did not do in the game, then you hang the rook on the e7 square, once again, as there is no checkmate threat on the g2 square. So, brilliant idea, rook to a6. Instead, here, black has to go queen d7. getting the queen out of the attack. But then Magnus, rook b6. The rook is now safe. The queen is now no longer threatening. Queen takes g2. That's an objectively good thing. But beyond that, there's no weird blunder, or then you get checkmated threat. And this is blitz. So anything can happen in a blitz game between Magnus and Hans. So excellent idea from Magnus Carlsen. And here, black has to find the right response. Turns out here, you got to get the bishop out of the attack. Bishop d5 is the key move. You're setting up bishop takes e6 threats. And from there, again, Hans will still be better. Instead, bishop c6 on the board. Why would he go to c6 instead of d5? Well, it's a blitz game. Things happen here. Now, in this position, Magnus has a one shot, and again, he misses. And this move was absolutely insane. You may as well deserve 10 Happy Meals if you can find this move. So if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find this one for Magnus Carlsen. It is sick. Here, the idea, rook takes c6, giving up the rook. And if you take it, there's these different checkmating ideas no matter what. For example, queen takes c6, then queen takes e7, threatening mate in 1. Instead, the better move is rook takes c6, but then rook to a8 is devastating. For example, again, rook c8, rook takes e7, again threatening checkmate on g7, and it's game over effectively. So rook takes c6, giving up the rook for the knight to basically checkmate black on the spot. That would have been the winning idea. Instead, he goes rook a to a6. Not a bad idea at all, increasing the pressure on c6. And here Niemann, he messes it up. Knight to f4, a blunder. And now Magnus, he just jumps in with the rook. Rook takes c6. The pair of rooks comes off the board. Obviously, queen takes c6 is met by queen takes e7. And what is Niemann going to do? He takes on the e6 square. Magnus takes back. Now Hans takes on e6, but then rook takes c4, winning the pawn. Now, of course, if queen takes c4, Magnus wins the rook on the e7 square, and that is what happens. And now we have a queen and pawn endgame. Magnus is up 2 pawns. Of course, the key pawns being those ones on the queen side, and beyond that, his king is also quite a bit safer. His king having those 3 pawns on the king side versus the 1 of Niemann. So now, how does Magnus Carlsen finish the game, or does he finish off at all? Here, Niemann, queen d5. Now Magnus finds an excellent rerouting idea. Queen to e8. The idea is you go to e8, then h4 with check, then e2. Here's the idea in action. Queen e8, queen h4, queen to e2. The queen defends the pawn on the b2 square, and there's nothing black can do to stop the pawns. Hans tries to get something going in the center, but then b4, followed by queen c4, queen d4, and finally b5. And in this position, Niemann had enough. There is no way to stop that pawn from simply rolling down the board. And here on move 48, Niemann resigned to Magnus Carlsen.